Art 120 Photography 1, we're going to get back into raw processing. This will be the second video that we will walk through some more functions within Camera Raw, getting our file to ready to open in Photoshop. There'll probably be one or two other raw videos where we'll go into a few other functions of raw, but this will be really walk us through the main processing. Just to show you another way to open your files in Camera Raw, I'm going to show you a way that you can navigate and open them through Bridge. So you can see here I have whatever 100 and something, 116 raw files. Later on we'll also talk about ways to batch process using the Camera Raw dialog box. So for pictures like this where I have, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pictures, and if I was going to composite these pictures to get this little cloud floating in every picture in various locations, which I actually did for this photograph, I might process all these, and they were shot in studio under the same lighting condition. So then I could process one and then set those settings over all of them, which I did, but for purposes of this class, I'm just going to start with just one file. So in Bridge, I have the file highlighted. You can see the bounding box around the image here. How I would open this in Camera Raw is you go up to this button that looks like an aperture of a lens and it says Open in Camera Raw, and you click on that button, and that will bring our picture open. Because I had already set today earlier in the hyperlink ProPhoto RGB 16-bit, the megapixel size of the camera, and then also the resolution. It's already set in this hyperlink, but it's always good to get in the habit of checking this before you do any work to your file. So just really quickly to review what we did in the first Camera Raw, we set the color space to ProPhoto RGB for the purposes of this class. Really, you'd be probably selecting either ProPhoto or Adobe 1998, but for this class now, just select ProPhoto RGB, 16-bit depth. As long as we have the file size or file storage, I would work in 16-bit. I'm not going to resize to fit here. Later on, we'll resize in Photoshop if we're going to resize. And then resolution, open at 360 and turn off sharpening, and don't worry about smart objects for now. Click OK, and then our hyperlink here gives our profile for that specific picture. Before I start setting on the settings, today I talked about one of the first things you might want to actually do is go to the optics drop-down menu, and then go down to where it says use profile corrections. Click on that drop-down menu and then click on the button. And then this one automatically loaded the camera profile in because it could read it. Sometimes it won't read it, but the camera that was used was a Canon. The lens was the EF 24 to 105, and then it sets the profile to this default here. Now if I want to see what's happening, if I go up to the optics where you see the optics title here, over to the right you'll see an eyeball, and if you click on and off that eye, you'll see how it's adjusting for the imperfections of how the camera lens and the sensor are working together. So the light coming through, it corrects for things like distortion, vignetting around the edges, and so forth. Now, one of the things you'll know is that here you can see it actually cropped down my image a little bit, right? So I would have to make a decision whether or not I think that is okay for this picture. When I look at this picture, the left side with the person's ear being cropped off feels a little awkward to me. So maybe I would not use this profile correction. Typically, I almost always use it. But in this picture, is the distortion, do I see the distortion or the way that the image is going to appear as a problem? Not really. So for this picture, I'm actually going to click off this use profile corrections. You get to sort of decide whether it makes sense or not, but just know that these profiles, what they're set to do is actually minimize really imperfections in how the lens and the sensor are working together. So here it actually got rid of, or it flattened out distortion, or it got rid of vignetting and so forth. But because I don't want to crop this person's ear on the left-hand side, I'm actually going to click that off. Now, knowing that, if I were to process all the images after this to get them to be the same, compiled on top of one another, I would make sure that this profile correction was also selected off on those. So I'm going to click out of this optics button. Later on we'll come back to talk about defringing a little bit and removing chromatic aberration, which I don't know, this might have some chromatic aberration around the edges here where we see the transition from light to dark. We're not going to do that now. We're going to go back to the basic settings first. So just really quickly to go through the basic settings, you can see here my histogram, right, my triangles when the warnings are clicked on so that I can see when I start to make adjustments if clipping is occurring. I'm going to go to the basic settings and I'm going to start with the white point slider. I'm going to move it up and you can see I can see the clipping starting to occur, so I'm going to back off. I'm going to zoom in just to see if I see any little red dots or not here. And when I start to see red, I'm going to back off. So 30 plus 30 looks pretty good for setting the white point. And then black point, we're going to do the same thing. And you can see here on the back of the jeans and down on the floor a little bit, there's some clipping that is occurring. So I'm going to back off there to retain the detail and those shadows. Plus 15. I'm actually going to crank it up a little bit and we'll see. That looks pretty good. Hit Command 0. Good, so 30 and 36 looks pretty good overall for the retaining the detail without losing clipping on either the white point or black point. Shadows, you know, here maybe I'll kind of zoom in a little bit and maybe I'll bump up. You know, I feel like the shadows in this picture are a little blocked up, so maybe I'd bring up the shadows, which is really the 3/4 tone, a little bit, and you can see the effect that's happening in the center of the frame. When you do that, just know that some noise might appear, so we'll see if there's noise a little later on. I'm going to hit Command 0, and now I'm going to make a adjustment. You know, the highlights to me look like I could actually maybe retain a little bit more detail by bringing down that highlight slider a bit, and you can really see a lot more detail kind of come in through that into that cloud as I brought that down. It was up higher value, like, you know, whatever, 0, and you can see you don't have a lot of definition in those highlights, so I'm going to bring that highlight down a bit, try to get a little bit more definition, and I think that looks pretty good. And if I wanted to bump up the exposure a little bit, I think that looks pretty good overall. Okay. Contrast, this was shot with fairly soft light. There's not, I think the contrast looks pretty good, but let's just take a look and see what happens if we bring down contrast. It starts to look a little too flat. If we bring it up, you know, actually I think maybe up a little bit, maybe somewhere around 8 looks pretty good. So if I want to see what we've done so far, if I click on and off the eye, you can see, right, all of a sudden there's a lot more detail in the shadows. I unblock the shadows. It did make the image a little bit flatter overall. There's a little less separation, but I just all of a sudden have a lot more detail. Maybe I don't like what's going on up top here. We'll talk about how to deal with those sorts of things a little later on. For exposure right now, I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to go into the white balance tool here. I would guess that this is probably pretty neutral, the fluffy clouds here, but we could use our white balance tool, which is next to the white balance where it says as shot. The white balance tool is it's the eyedropper, and if you drop it on something that's neutral and you click on whatever should be neutral, it should neutralize your photograph overall. We're not going to get really into color in this class so much, but I do want you to just get into the habit of trying to create what's called a color balance in the picture by using the white balance tools. So, or I could try, I know that this is let's try flash. Flash will probably be a little cool. Let's see what daylight looks like. A little bit warmer, cloudy, a little too warm. So I actually here with this one, I would use this eyedropper tool. I think it did the best job of creating a white balance or color balance throughout. So that looks pretty good for color right now. As we talked about, texture, clarity, and dehazing is boosting contrast selectively in selective areas. I don't think that this picture, let's just see what happens if we add some texture. I don't think this picture really needs it because it's going to start to get crunchy and weird. Clarity, let's slide that up a little bit. Yeah, I would not use any of these sliders with this picture, to be honest with you. Vibrance is going to boost the contrast in areas where there, I'm sorry, not contrast, but the saturation, where it feels like parts are undersaturated. This one I might actually bring up a little bit here, 10%, or try to bring up the saturation to see. I actually think the vibrance slider is doing a better job, so I'm going to bring up, and I'm doing this all by eye right now, and the vibrance slider will add saturation to places that are a little less saturated in the image overall. Okay, and then for now I'm going to close out of the basic, and I'm just going to click on and off the eye so you can see the changes that were made. And now I'm going to zoom in, and we're going to zoom into about 100%, and I'm going to zoom in to these edges right here, and this is where we're going to work on looking at, and actually I can see a little chromatic aberration right there. So let's go ahead, go back to the optics, click off chromatic aberration, or click on chromatic aberration, and you'll see it got rid of that aberration that was happening there. If you want to see what's happening, you click on and off the eye, you can see right where that little squiggle is of the cloud, there's a little bit of cyan that's hitting the bottom, and that's an aberration due to the lens. So you can see if I click on and off the eye, you can see what it's doing there. Okay, so now we're gonna go through and do. Now we're zoomed in 400%. I'm gonna zoom out to 100%, and we're gonna do a little bit of sharpening, and we're gonna look to see if there's any noise in this photograph. And really, this sensor is really pretty good overall, so I don't really see a ton of noise happening. I do see a little divoting, that texture that could have been added. But we're gonna zoom in right here because I think you can see a nice edge here, and you can see the textures here, and this will help us in terms of looking at how we are sharpening our picture. So we're not going to use curves here. The next slider down set of sliders that we're going to use, and which will be the last set of sliders for this lesson in Camera Raw, will be the sharpening and the noise reduction. I may bring up another picture to just show you noise, because this picture is not that noisy. So just to show you what is happening with the reduction of noise. So for sharpening, I'm just looking at edges right now. So I'm looking at the edges of this piece of newspaper, the edges of this whatever is making the clouds, also the edges of the sweater here. So I'm going to start with sharpening, and I'm going to click on the down arrow. And what was saved, I believe, was from the last time. Actually, no, they went back to the default. So to begin with sharpening, again, just remember, all sharpening is it's not going to take your picture if it's out of focus and put it in focus. It's just going to add selectively contrast on edges or certain parts of your pictures where you're telling the sharpening to occur. And it's just going to boost contrast and make it look sharper. It's actually not, again, going to make your picture in focus. So what we're going to start with is the masking tool. It used to be, I think I mentioned this in class, that I would never use the sliders here ever in Camera Raw until they gave us these two sliders, the detail and masking sliders, because you couldn't selectively decide where sharpening was occurring. It would happen over the whole picture. This allows you to selectively decide. So I'm going to zoom out for a second to show you. Areas that you would not want to sharpen are big areas like this, which are either out of focus, or if they're big areas of really kind of similar tone. Where you're looking to really sharpen are on edges of your picture. So for the masking, I'll actually zoom out for the masking so you can see it, and then I'll zoom back in. To see where you're going to be applying the masking, you hold down the option button, and then you start to move the masking slider up. Now, what I don't want to sharpen is the background at all. I want to let that be masked out. It is masked out when it turns black. What that means, again, remember this analogy of having a plate of glass. Wherever you are clear on the plate of glass, the application or the adjustment is going to come through. Wherever it's black, just think of it as you're putting black gaffer's tape down on top of that plate of glass. You're blocking that adjustment from coming through. So that's where this term masking comes from. It comes from the days of working in the darkroom when we actually used to do this with adding exposure selectively to parts of your picture by using plates of glass and tape. So here, what I want is the sharpening only to occur on the edges. And what I'm seeing right now with the edges of the big cloud burst, the edges of the person on the left-hand side, and then the person that's underneath the cloud with their sweater and their pants and their feet and so forth, all of those edges are where I do want the sharpening to occur. I'm going to zoom in a little bit just to see, to fine tune so I can see where this is being applied. And again, I don't want to really sharpen the background at all. I just really want to hit those edges. So I'm going to crank this up a little bit higher. I think somewhere around 57 for this picture look pretty good. Detail slider. This one's going to be a little bit harder to see, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. And if you go all the way up to 100, you can see you start to get those really bizarre looking divots, and you want to really slide this way back. In detail, I usually never go above probably at the most in the 20s. But really for a picture like this, even less than that, I think probably about 15. Now remember, it's always better to err on the side of under sharpening than over sharpening. Because we are going to apply some sharpening in output, this is really a sharpen that's just really based on input, so or capture as we refer to it, which is based on again, the imperfections of the lens and the light coming through the lens and hitting the sensor. Naturally things get a little bit soft, so this helps clean up that softness. But again, we want to err on the side of not over sharpening. Radius, as I talked about, those numbers, this refers to how far the sharpening will spread out across pixels. For images that have a lot of fine edge like this here, I would say radius somewhere between 0.6 and up to 1 at the most. And for images, and I would hold down the option button again, for images, so if you see what's happening is I go way up to 3 pixels, it's spreading out way too far and the image will get super crunchy. For images that are really kind of smoother and fewer hard edges, I would say somewhere around 1.2 to 1.8 at the most, maybe 1.6. For this image, I'm going to start, let's see, I'm going to say either 0.8 or 1. I'm going to start at 0.8. I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer so you can just see the effect a little bit more. I'm going to go to finally the sharpening. And you're going to see, if I have it cranked all the way down, you can really see how soft it is. So this is no sharpening being applied at all. And I'm going to start to bring it up until the image starts to look a little bit sharper. And actually, you can really see that text coming through. It almost looks like you can read it now. Before, it's almost completely illegible. But if you go up too high, you start to get all these kind of weird textures that appear, and that's bad. So I'm going to say somewhere probably around, for this image, this is pretty high. This is a high sharpen, around 80%. That looks pretty good. If I click on it off that eye, you're going to see a big difference in really the lettering that's happening there. I'm going to click it all the way up to 100 so you can just see, if I click on it off the eye, really it made those words almost legible. You can almost read them. The problem that you're getting is in these areas that start to look like it's a watercolor or something. That's bad. That's not good. So I'm going to back off because I don't want it to look like a watercolor. Later on, I can show you some techniques to really make those letters pop a little bit more. So I think that's pretty good for sharpening. Now let's see if we see any noise anywhere. Where we would see noise is in shadow areas of the picture. There's already some noise reduction being applied. So I'm going to just crank down that tool a little bit. So let's see, maybe right there, that looks like a little bit of noise. Let's bring up the color noise reduction slider. Yeah, actually that did a pretty good job. So if you click on off that eye, you can see there's a little bit of noise. This image is not that noisy. Really, all I'm doing, really when you're using noise reduction, I always start with the color noise reduction first and then go to these other sliders up here, which are really for pictures that have a ton of noise, if you're shooting at a really high ISO or something like that. But for the color noise, I can probably reduce a lot of it just by moving the slider somewhere between 25 and 30, and then using the detail and smoothness to look at how it's being applied. So similarly to how you use the detail up here, click and you kind of drag that back and forth. And I really don't see a big change here, so I'm going to just leave it at the default, which is 50. For detail smoothness, we dial it down, dial it up. When you dial it up, you'll start to see right along that edge right there. Let's see if you can see it. You can see that it starts to actually blur it a little bit, so you want to be careful with this. Really, the defaults are really close for this picture. I'll probably leave them at both at 50-50, and then the noise reduction at 25. We'll talk a little bit more about noise reduction and a little later on as well. I'll open up another picture so you can see it. These other color mixer, as I mentioned in class, really don't want to mess with this too much. Later on, maybe we'll talk a little bit about how a lot of times, more so in scanners, but also in older chips, red channel tend to oversaturate, so we might go into the red channel and take a little saturation out of the red. Here I'm not seeing as much of a problem with these newer chips, so we're not going to really work with color mixer here too much. We'll work with it a little bit more in Photoshop as a tool, and we're also not really working in color, so it's not going to really matter too much. Split toning, no, not going to worry about that at all. Geometry, let's see, I'm going to close out of this picture really quickly. I'm going to hit done. If you hit done here, all the settings that we set will be saved in that XMP file that will be saved alongside, but it doesn't mean that you're opening the image in Photoshop, so it just means that you're done with this for now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate back to my raw files here, and I'm going to go to this picture 03. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the noise that we saw here in this area of the picture. So if you remember, here I cranked up the noise reduction to 68, and you can see if I bring it down all the way, there's a ton of noise that appears right there, a ton of color noise. If we bring up this noise reduction, it's not going to do a lot here. So we're going to bring down this one for now, and we're going to work with the color noise reduction because it is happening in color. And what I did was I started with this slider, and let's see, let's just set this at the defaults 50-50. And I brought up the noise reduction until basically I saw that noise reduction go completely away. And then I use the detail sliders. I'm going to zoom in so you can just see what's happening. So the detail slider, if you have it down lower, it retains more of the detail, but some noise might come back a little bit. Smoothness, you can see when it's all the way down, all of a sudden there's a bunch of weird noise artifacting that's happening here. So I'm going to bring up the smoothness. And I think we have this pretty high without it losing its sharpness. That's pretty good right there. 68, 44, 68. I thought it pretty good. So noise reduction and sharpening you work with in conjunction with one another. And as I mentioned in class, you could probably teach a whole class on sharpening. It is that complicated. I'm going to go down after we went through color mixer, split toning, optics. Remember, this one I actually did select the profile. If you want to see what the effect that's happening, you can actually see the image correcting. If I click off the profile, on and off the profile, it's very, very subtle in this picture, but if you were to look at the lamp or even the window, you can see really look at the window, you can see how it's going from being, it looks like it's sticking out to being more flat. And that's really, again, correcting for the issues that happen in capture between the lens and the sensor. We removed the chromatic aberration in this picture. Let's just zoom in so you can see where that aberration is happening. There's a transitional area here. If you click on and off that eye, let's see, I don't remember if we saw it here. It's not too bad there. I think it was really kind of up in the lamp where we saw a lot of aberration happening. Yeah, you can really see it. If you look at the edge here, I'm zooming into 1600% so you can really see it. When I click off the remove chromatic aberration, you can see it's getting rid of that red fringing that's happening. This button has really become a lot better in the later versions of Camera Raw. So we remove the chromatic aberration. I'm not going to work on defringing right now. I'm going to leave the defringing as is. I'm going to close out of the optics. Geometry was something we did work with. Remember, the default was 0. And you can see what I was looking at really were these lines on the right-hand side. Now, to me, the left-hand side looks really pretty straight. The right-hand side looks a little bit off. If I move, I can straighten out that line. And this is just using this tool here, which is the vertical. Now, it's better to do it here than in Photoshop because remember, Photoshop is a destructive program, so you're really going to throw away a lot more information once you get into Photoshop. The problem I'm seeing in this picture is really, I think, another issue, which could be just leveling of the camera when I photographed this picture. If I straighten the line on the right-hand side, the left-hand side seems like it goes in. So I actually probably would not use this here, and I would probably maybe let's see what happens. I'm just looking overall at the image. Yeah, maybe I would use it a little bit less, maybe -2, -3, something like that. That helps straighten it out a little bit. This again is really if you're trying to change if you're working with an architectural space and you're trying to get all the lines pretty straight, this is a really helpful tool to use, the geometric. Straightening of vertical and horizontal, if you needed to rotate your image. Aspect, I probably would not mess with that so much. So I'm going to close out of geometry for now. We're not going to get into effects, the vignetting. Really, we dealt with that in optics with this picture. When you hit the manual button, you have vignetting that you can either reduce or enhance. And all I'm doing here is really trying to get this so the edges and the corners look pretty even. So +10 to me looks pretty good, looks pretty even throughout. Just so you can see what the distortion button does. Whoa. And actually, when you go to profile, this is all set for you because they've created profiles for your camera lens if your camera lens shows up in this use profile corrections. So you don't really need to go to the manual and mess with the distortion or vignetting. Other than that, we will get into some of these other functions, these other tools on the right-hand side in subsequent videos for Camera Raw, but I think that's it for assignment 3. I just want you to start to work with capture sharpening a little bit and noise reduction, then also set your optics, which is your camera lens. And then once you're done, you can either hit done and it won't open the image, but your metadata will be saved, so you can just go then back, and then when you hit or double click your picture, your file, as long as your metadata is there, it will open up your file with those changes. And then you could re-edit, or you can hit open and begin to work on your picture in Photoshop. That is it for the second Camera Raw video. And you're going to see the image appear. Photoshop launches. Takes just a minute. And eventually, it's a pretty big file. There's my picture. So that's it for this Camera Raw video.